Hey guys, welcome to this video on stelliums through the houses in astrology. If you have a stellium in your natal chart in astrology, this video is for you. I'm Cassandra, the Saffron Sage, helping you use astrology to evolve, and let's talk about stelliums through the houses. So I have another video on what stelliums are. You can check that out if you don't know what a stellium is. But for the purposes of this video, you guys, it is a group of planets in one sign or one house. So you could have a stellium through one sign, a bunch of planets there, but they're not in the same house. Or you can have a bunch of planets in a house, but they are in between two different signs, unless you're using whole sign. And in that case, you would have a stellium by house. Some people have both. And so a quick definition is 3 or more planets in one sign or one house. And I will say that if you have like Mercury, the Sun, and Venus, this is pretty common because the Sun, Venus and Mercury are never too far away from the Sun. Mercury can only be one sign ahead or one sign behind, and Venus can only be 2 ahead or 2 behind. And so the chances of having a stellium with Mercury, Venus, and the Sun are pretty high. And then once you add the outer planets, if you think about this, so for example, right now we have Saturn and Jupiter in Aquarius. Now, if the Sun and Mercury and Venus all passed through Aquarius at the same time, like it did last year, well then we have a stellium. So this does happen quite frequently in astrology just because of how it all plays out, but it still does have a significant emphasis in the chart. So we're going to talk about what that means. If you have a stellium, the first thing you want to do is look at the sign, look at the house, read up about those energies. It really does simply mean that you have a lot of energy in that sign or in that house. So if you have a stellium in Libra and you have like 5 planets there or 3 planets there, then that just means you have a lot of Libra energy. Keep in mind that for a stellium, the rising sign doesn't count. However, I think that it still does tend to make you have an emphasis of that energy. So don't get too hung up on those kind of definitions. That's not really the point of astrology. It's to say, oh, you have your rising sign here, so yours is not a stellium, and you have your, it's like, none of that really matters. What matters is your experience of having the planets in a certain sign or a certain house. Before we get into everything else, you guys, I want to tell you about a special I'm doing on my astrology consultations. They are over 40% off right now if you choose the 1-hour consultation. This is a sale that goes until Friday, the 17th of December. So make sure you get in on that. They are going quickly and they fill up fast. So if you want one of those, grab one. And if you are not on my mailing list, this is where I always announce any kind of special or new offer I'm doing. So make sure you grab the free guide, align with your midheaven so that you're on that list. You get the guide and you'll be notified when I do stuff like this in the future. And now back to our video. Okay, so that all being said, let's talk about, we're just going to go through the houses really quick, what it means. If you have a first house stellium, the first house is all about our identity, who we are, our body, who we are in the world, the way that we approach the world. So it's like the way you are when you walk into a room, that's going to be determined by your first house. The way other people see you, that's going to also be determined by your first house. And people with a lot of planets here will usually have a strong personality and a strong emphasis on other people, whether they see that in themselves or not. The type of planets you have in the first house can also determine the way that you show up in the world in addition to your rising sign. And the closer the planet is to your rising sign, the more likely that is going to infuse with your rising sign and almost be like a part of your rising sign or how you come across. So someone, let's say with Mercury conjunct their rising sign really, really close, is probably either going to be a marketer or a copywriter because they are going to have the gift of gab. They're going to have a way with words. It's just part of their personality. So they'll either be a chatterbox or they'll be really, really great writers or have somehow Mercury type things infused into their personality. I think one example might be someone who does like shipping and receiving just because Mercury rules that as well. So it doesn't always have to be a chatterbox, but the likelihood that this person is a talker or a great communicator is very high. So moving on though, just to the first house in general, the positive sides of having a first house stellium is a lot of emphasis in your lifetime is about you. It's about how you come across, how you present yourself, who you are. And the way to go deeper on a stellium, for example, with the first house, is to see not just what planets are there, but what house those planets rule. So let's say you have your 10th house ruler in the first house. The 10th house is the house of career. It's what you can be known for. Many people with the 10th house ruler in the first could either work with their body, they could lead, they could demonstrate, or they could be their own personal brand. There's a lot of emphasis with that placement on like being able to show up as your business, really being out or being like an ambassador for someone else's brand, things like that. The challenges with a first house stellium can be either too much emphasis on the self, on trying to form your own identity and having a hard time relating to others, because the opposite of that first house is your 7th house. Or possibly being a little too much of whatever your planets there are. You know, someone with a first house stellium could just be a little too much for people in whatever way that planet is. Moving on now to the 2nd house. If you have a stellium in your 2nd house, then 2nd house topics are going to be super important to you. So these are going to be things like money, values, security, your own possessions, and anything you own or have, any skills you have. So with this 2nd house stellium, you're probably gonna really want to show up and give value. You'll want to make money. You'll want to have enough. And so the way an emphasis like this works is it can actually go a few different ways. One person with this stellium could have all the things in the world because the feeling of wanting to have that is so important. It's just a given for them. Another person could not be able to get those things for whatever reason, and they could be very, very troubled by that. So it's like if your house your stellium lies in isn't happy, you're not happy. Oftentimes too, planets do represent dysfunctions, okay? They represent challenges. So oftentimes people with a stellium will have some challenges in that area. That'll be their challenge. And sometimes the challenge with a stellium is to do anything else. So some people with stelliums will have a harder time doing the other things because they just have so much energy pulling them back to that thing that is represented by that house. But it can also be totally balanced and that theme just shows up and is really important to their life. If you have a 3rd house stellium, this could show up in a couple different ways. The 3rd house rules short bursts of communication. It rules our trips, like running errands, our neighborhood. It also rules our siblings, and it can be teaching and learning, but if it's teaching and learning, it's not going to be the meaning of life type of teaching and learning. It will either be teaching and learning in smaller doses, teaching and learning topics that are more superficial, that aren't going deep into like this is what it all means. Or it can also be teaching and learning beginners or like even elementary school students, depending on what planets are there and what houses they rule. Potential challenges if you have a 3rd house stellium, and this is actually from experience because I have this too. You can have problems with calming the mind because the 3rd house is really the mind, how we think. And you could have a busy mind. You could be really smart and not be able to focus your energy, right? You could be distractible, easily distracted. You could have challenges with your siblings here, or your sibling relationships could be really, really important to you. You could also have a hard time communicating. So communication is probably going to be a theme for someone with a 3rd house stellium. And again, it's likely going to be short bursts of communication or communication that is not like philosophy. That would go in the 9th house. Unless you have other planets to mitigate that, or you have like Jupiter here. Moving on to the 4th house, if you have a 4th house stellium, home is really important. So this can go one way or the other, where either you love your home, you love your family, you're very, very close to them, you have very, very close bonds, or you create a family of your own, you're a family man or a family woman in that sense. Or it could go the totally other direction, where breaking away from the family is a theme in your life that matters a lot to you, breaking away from your roots, your ancestors, your home, your family, things like that. This is also the house of real estate. So some people with a 4th house stellium could be in real estate. Not everyone will, okay? So it can show up either way. And that's pretty much everything. Another thing that can show up in the 4th house is like being a homebody, okay? So If you have a lot of planets here, you might really love being at home. You could work from home as well, especially if your 10th house ruler is the one in that 4th house. Moving on now to the 5th house. If you have a 5th house stellium, you might have more emphasis in your life on things that are fun, creative expression, gambling, children, or anything else represented by the 5th house. The 5th house is called the fun house because it's like the house of creativity, entertainment, expressing ourselves, kids. If you have a 5th house stellium, you could be like in the entertainment industry in some way. You could be very entertaining. You could just value anything that I mentioned. You know, you could just really like self-expression, forms of self-expression. So it's not as much like art as much as it is like having fun being who you are, comedy, making jokes, being around people, being present in the moment and having fun in the moment. Anything that brings joy in the moment is in the 5th house. So you could find one of your major life themes is something like that brings joy in the moment. The dysfunctions that could happen if you have a stellium here, one of the possible dysfunctions here is like having a gambling addiction or something else where there's so much emphasis on having joy in the moment, things that are fun in the moment, but aren't necessarily good for the person long term. So this does not mean everyone with this placement has a gambling addiction. It's just one way these energies could show up, and that it's like the worst potential manifestation. Other really bad potential manifestations here would be like having problems with children. If you have a stellium in the 6th house, then themes of that house are going to be more significant. So the themes that can show up for people with concentrations of energies in the 6th house are service, your daily work, your daily schedule, your daily routine, your health, and also mentors and teachers fall into this category. People who have a mentor-teacher relationship, also employees or subordinates. So like people who work under you, you working under other people, that can also be a theme. There's also a theme here of service and compassion, like for the world, really caring about being of service. So if you have a stellium here, you could really like do charity work. You could do work that helps people, like do social work or have some kind of cause around that really matters to you. Another way this could show up is you could work your butt off, okay? You could be a really, really hard worker if you have a stellium here, or you could not like have an aversion to work or be doing things to not have to work. So one way or the other, you know, like working hard all the time, or possibly being someone who finds like ways to have that 4-hour work week, you know, stuff like that. Those are the kinds of things that we can see with someone with a 6th house stellium. Again, health can show up, and oftentimes when health shows up in the chart, it's not necessarily a good indicator. Having planets in the 6th house are not positive indicators for health. This doesn't mean you're determined to be sick your whole life, but that someone with a 6th house stellium, it wouldn't surprise me if this person had some kind of health struggle at some point in their life, just because that is the indication of this house. This is also the house of loss. Okay, so it's a tough house to have planets in, even just one planet, because it's like the thing of that planet could be lost at some point in your life. This does not mean if you have a 6th house stellium, everything's gonna be lost, but that you could have had some kind of major event in your life characterized by loss, or it's really hard to say in a general way, but you know, the theme of loss could show up in your life in a strong way related to the planets that you have there and whatever house they rule. So let's say you have your 10th house ruler in the 6th house. Well, that would possibly be a loss of a certain job or a loss of reputation at some point. This does not mean this has to happen. It's just a potential. 7th house stellium. If you have a stellium in the 7th house, then partnerships are way more important to you. For some people with planets here, this can actually be a challenge for the person more than the other people, because the person with the planets in the 7th house is going to sort of like bend over backwards to keep love in their life or to keep their relationships happy. And depending on what the planets are, but if this is how this expresses for you, you have to learn how to be your own independent self within relationships. And that can be a real challenge for people with more sensitive planets in that 7th house. If you have like Mars or Pluto or even like Saturn in the 7th, this can bring challenges to relationships or make those be the areas of life that are harder. Wherever we have Saturn is going to be like a challenging area where we kind of restrict ourselves or we feel like we don't get that thing. So there's that possibility. There's a possibility that relationships are, while they might be important, they also could be more challenging, but it depends on the person. So one person with the 7th house stellium could be the kind of person who's always in a relationship. You know, you see them, they break up, they're with someone new, and they're always with someone. Another person with the 7th house stellium could have 3 major relationships during their life. Another one could have actually a long stretch where they're not in a relationship, because even though you have planets in a place, it doesn't mean like, oh, your 7th house, you're going to get married. It's not like that. It could mean that you feel how single you are when you're not with someone, or you have a major relationship that ends, and that ending is harder to get over, and so you end up being alone for longer because of that. It can have many other different possible explanations, but these are some of the main things we see. Either way, this person with the 7th house stellium usually has some challenges or some things to learn during their life about the difference between me and you, right? The difference between my goals and your goals. And, they could have phases in life where they're taking the back seat and their partner's goals become priority. They could have that be their whole life. They could also have phases in life where, they're just on their own. These themes are just going to be more important. Also, business partnerships can show up here as well. So for some people with the 7th house stellium, they will actually be happier or be more successful, especially if their 10th ruler is in the 7th. They'll be more successful in partnership with the right people. Moving on now to the 8th house. If you have an 8th house stellium, this is a very nebulous, challenging, but also really awesome at the same time kind of energy. The 8th house can be many, many things, so I'll try to break down all of the possibilities. This probably won't show up in every way. You're probably going to relate to just one of these, maybe 2. Themes that could be really important in your life: 1, sexuality; 2, the occult, the other side, the paranormal, psychic abilities; 3, other people's money, managing other people's money, dealing with estates, financial planning, anything that involves the resources of other people; 4, having a spouse or a partner whose money, like the way you merge together is really important, or merging with powerful people. Other ways people with 8th house stelliums can have, like other experiences they can have, is they could learn how to they can be psychic. They can study the paranormal. They can work with psychic. They can do psychic work. They can do like tarot readings, stuff like that. They could also have more than the average experiences with death. Some people with planets in the 8th house will just be around death a little bit more than normal. So this could go from being a death doula, working with fields that deal with death or cremation or anything relating to dying. Or they could also find that they are present for people in their lives who have someone pass away. So they could be the person who people come to when someone has died, just because it's like you become the gift to those people. Those are some potential ways an 8th house stellium can translate, although this one is pretty complex. So moving on now to the 9th house. If you have a stellium in your 9th house, in your natal chart in astrology, that is going to be an emphasis on 9th house things. So stuff like philosophy, higher learning, higher education, college, studying abroad, living abroad, traveling, again, philosophy, the law. So this can be learning or teaching really in-depth topics. So the difference between the 3rd house and the 9th house is the 3rd house is also like learning and matters of the mind, but it's little bits of information or knowing a little bit about a lot. The 9th house is knowing a lot about a little. And so that theme can show up in your life of publishing as well. So publishing a book or publishing a body of work is possible if you have a stellium here. You could also just really care more or, be more interested in foreign affairs. So like foreign policy or negotiating with foreign countries or working in a foreign country or having some kind of business activity that involves people from different countries or clients from different countries. Really a lot of different things, but the main key things are like philosophy, the law, in-depth things. Also this can be the meaning of life, like studying the meaning of life or teaching the meaning of life, or like someone who studies spiritual studies, but it's like very, very in-depth and really more about the meaning of the things and not as much about the facts. So it doesn't mean you can't understand facts, but that if you're teaching facts, like your own belief system or the deeper meaning needs to be infused into it, or probably will be, just because that is what the ninth house is about. It is also our belief system. Sometimes with the ninth house, like the possible negative thing with the ninth house stellium or a lot of ninth house energy is going to be things like cults, trying to get yourself out of a cult, getting stuck in belief systems or feeling limited by belief systems. Sometimes people with ninth house placements could potentially get into a cult and then like need to get out of it. Or it's possible too that it could go the other way, where someone finds meaning through religion, through spirituality, or through some other kind of group membership that makes them feel like they belong, and that's how they really learn and relate to life. Either way, the potential downside here is the challenge of expanding the belief system, the challenge of whatever that looks like, because sometimes we can believe things, but to be able to integrate those beliefs isn't always easy. So moving on now to the 10th house. If you have a stellium in the 10th house, or a concentration of energy here, you will really care a lot about your job and your work. Depending on what planets are here, this can go a few different ways. Someone with a 10th house stellium could just really want to be recognized, and usually, depending on the planet, this can look like being willing to put in the work that it takes to get to the top. Oftentimes that's going to be what this means. It could also be really having long-term goals in career, and not just wanting to have a little career or, an okay career, but really having a desire for greatness. It could be that this person works a lot. Their career is very important. They live, eat, and breathe their work, because the 10th house represents what we're known for. So it's possible you could be known for something and it's not your career. So possibly a stay-at-home mom who's always wanted to be a stay-at-home mom and loves that role, that could possibly be how a 10th house stellium shows up, because they love their role in life. Okay, the thing they're known for. And known doesn't have to be famous. Known can be in your community, in your town, in your family. And so it doesn't always have to show up in work, although most of the times it will. Someone with a 10th house stellium could possibly be a workaholic, or just put so much time and energy into their work. They could have several different jobs, and they will probably really want to be successful, whether they are or they're not. They're going to be driven to be successful. Whether the person is or isn't doesn't show up from the planets here necessarily, but they do kind of tend to tell us like a little bit about your potential. So like if you have Mars here, you have the potential to do the work that it takes to get to the top. If you have Saturn, you can watch my video on Saturn and Capricorn, but Saturn is going to be like, it won't happen until after your Saturn return. You might slowly start seeing the rewards of your career after you're 28 and, etc. So the 10th house is really our role in life. It is career. It is what we're known for. It's not just career, but it's like what we're known for. In one of my videos, I go through every planet in the 10th house. So if you have a 10th house stellium, you should definitely watch that video. Moving on now to the 11th house. So the 11th house is going to be our group membership, how we belong to different groups, the groups that we belong to, our audience, our friends, our groups of friends, any like subscription we subscribe to or thing we go to, anything we join where there's people, that is the 11th house. So someone with an 11th house stellium could do something like have a social media account and do that really, really well. 11th house planets are good for social media success, or gaining an audience. So if you don't have 11th house planets and you want to gain an audience, get a friend who does, make videos or do content with somebody who does, because they'll be able to attract that audience. But if you have the 11th house stellium, you could be the one who people, you're the one who attracts the audience. That doesn't mean you want to, right? Because some people with 11th house stelliums don't necessarily want that. Other ways this could show up is groups of people are important in your life. So you could join certain groups at different times in life that change your life. You could create some kind of group like this, even if it's not social media. It could be like a group coaching program or something where you are the one who is doing that. Another potential for the 11th house is like you could make money off of your work, because 11th house is the second from the 10th. So it's like the income that you get from whatever you do in your 10th house work is in the 11th. So having an 11th house stellium doesn't guarantee that you're going to be rich, but it is a good sign of potential abundance from the work that you do. If abundance is going to come through the 11th house, it will be through the work you've done yourself in the 10th house or with other people, but it's not going to be a lottery win. Other things I think of with the 11th house are actors, people who need to win the favor of the public. That we see that in the 10th house, but we also see it in the 11th house, where it's like they're going to feel like you're friends with them. You can make people feel like they are your friend, even if you just chatted them on Instagram one time, and it's like they will always feel like you are their friend. And so people with like actors or people who need to develop that, you know, with large groups of people tend to have 11th house placements. It can also be successful group things, okay? Successful things you do in a group. So like if you had a podcast and you had 3 people, if you have a packed 11th house, a group podcast could potentially do better than a solo cast, just because your planets really lend themselves to working in a group and being successful. And that can show up in any area of life, not just podcast or not just fame. So you could work in groups of people creating children's toys or designing Pixar movies or something like that. And the group, the 11th house planets contribute to the success of the group. Now that also depends on which planets are there. So if you have Saturn or Mars, you're probably going to have more challenges. Whereas if you have like Venus or Jupiter, these are definitely more positive. So moving on now to the 12th house. If you have a 12th house stellium, this is a concentration of energy around 12th house things. So the 12th house represents things we hide from ourselves, which is why it can be called like the house of self-sabotage. It also represents endings and kind of like the energy of surrender. So if you have planets in the 12th house, first of all, it's like there's a need to face things, because with planets in the 12th house, it's like every planet in the 12th house is like something you're keeping hidden from yourself. And so in order to deal with that 12th house planet, there's a need to face things. The 12th house in astrology also represents things like institutions. So like one person with 12th house planets could have been a prison guard, where another person could go to prison. And so you could work with isolation. You could work with people in isolation. You could work with people to develop their spiritual practice, because transcendence is a part of the 12th house. And unfortunately, usually things we transcend are not things we feel happy about. You know, these are not things that we're celebrating usually. So the most negative manifestation of a 12th house stellium could be prison time, or going to treatment, or doing something else where you're taken away from society. But the most positive of that same stellium could be like going on a pilgrimage, you know, like eat, pray, love style, going to travel the world and being somehow isolating yourself, like going to a monastery and becoming a monk, or studying with monks, or doing other kinds of spiritual work that involves transcendence. I think the highest expression of the 12th house is spirituality in some way, a spiritual practice. Because there's a need for this person to really get quiet to sort of sort these things out a little bit. And I also feel that depending on what planet is there, this can also be an indication of, sometimes it can be spiritual work. So if your 10th ruler is in the 12th, then this can be an indication that the type of work you do is with people in isolation. Again, working with people in prisons, working with people in treatment, or in monasteries, or in other situations where they isolate themselves from society, or they are isolated, whether they choose to or not. But it can also be like working with transcendence, so working with archetypes, working with myth, working with the deeper meaning of our psyche, really going in depth to the deepest depths of the psyche. Some people see this in the 8th house. I think it can go in either the 8th or the 12th. With the 12th, to me, it's more about transcendence. You could work with people in altered states of consciousness. You could have altered states of consciousness. I think these fall under both categories, just because they are both very, very spiritual. They can be very, very spiritual. It's the merging. 8th house is merging with others. 12th house is merging with the collective unconscious. So if you think about the types of work you could do, this would be like the Akashic records, or hypnotherapy, or I think of Edgar Cayce and how he would hypnotize himself and go into a trance. You know, anything that involves trance, anything that involves Reiki could be in this house as well, really going into that deeper state or assisting others in going into that state. So like shamanic work where you're journeying with people, that kind of stuff. And I'm sure there's many other modalities that fit under that umbrella, but that's another one of the most positive manifestations of the 12th house. And don't be afraid if you have 12th house planets, like there's all these things I don't know about myself, or like it kind of gets a bad rap. So don't be afraid of the bad things happening, because the thing about the 12th house is the negative things that happen in the 12th house are as a result of not facing things. So if you don't face that you have a stealing problem when you're a teenager and you keep stealing, well, then by the time you're an adult, you might be in prison for it if you go down that road. But you are the one who chooses the road you go down. So if you have a 12th house stellium and you find that you've faced something early on in life, or that you're facing things all the time and you're like really working on yourself, then you don't have to be afraid too much of like getting institutionalized, because nobody just randomly gets institutionalized. It's a result of not looking at things for many, many years usually. So hopefully that helps you guys not feel like the 12th house is impending doom, because there's a lot of gifts that come with this placement, the number one being compassion. And also doing things that involve compassion, things that involve social services, social work, really helping people. Sometimes we see this in the 6th house with the need to be of service, but we also can see this at times in the 12th house when it comes to, again, that ability to transcend suffering and wanting to help other people to transcend their suffering. So oftentimes, if you are working with people in some kind of public service, it's more like to recover from addiction, or to recover from mental illness, or to recover from the things that fall in that 12th house. So again, prisons, mental illness, or addiction, things that take people escape from. So when you're helping people deal with that escape, and oftentimes it's because usually the person with the 12th house placements knows that in some way that's personal to them. So this may not be you. This could be you had a parent who had a mental illness and now you help people with mental illnesses. That's just one example. That's not going to apply to everyone. But those are some examples of how the 12th house doesn't necessarily mean your life is wrecked. So I just wanted to give you guys some of those. And that's it. So we've gone through all the houses. Make sure you get my free guide, Align with Your Midheaven, that teaches you how to align with your midheaven to align with the career you're meant for. And also, you guys, make sure you get on that list, because that's where I'm going to be announcing first when I do these free events I'm going to be starting doing. I'm going to be doing more online events about like life purpose and astrology. So be sure to check that out. Get on that list so you're the first to know. And I will see you all in the next video.